Akora. I am one of the co-directors for the LSE Africa Summit and head of the media and marketing team. And I have the privilege of saying welcome to the LSE Africa Summit. It promises to be a fun-packed, filled and exciting and invigorating summit. So as our first segment of the first day, I would like to introduce Professor Tim Allen, who is the inaugural director of the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa.
Hello everyone. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left today on my bicycle and I noticed I'm wearing a tie. So I thought either I'm getting married or it must be, Saturday morning, must be the Africa Summit in person for the first time in a couple of years. Isn't it wonderful all to be here together? Actually, I'm just noticing there's not a huge number of people, but I imagine that's partly because they're all going to be joining us a bit later, and I understand there's a tube problem today, so there's engineering works that are colliding with plans. But it's fantastic to welcome you all here. This is actually the 10th summit, and in those days that we can barely remember before COVID struck, the summit was a huge event at the LSE with large numbers of people coming here and having a really spectacular time. It was, the biggest event at the LSE annually. And so we're sort of beginning again. These are first steps, and it's just amazing that the team has been able to put together this tremendous program for us today. I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at it, but as you see, it's about youth, which makes it highly appropriate for me to be the person introducing this, because I'm very young at heart, and also youth in Africa I think is rather an expansive concept, isn't it? I mean, sometimes I travel around African countries, and I'm introduced to the Minister of Youth, and he's like a physical disaster area and about 70 years old, and I think, if he can do it, I can do it. So that's going to be my future. I'm going to represent youth as I move forward, because youth is certainly the future of Africa, isn't it? I mean, in some of the countries in which I work, youth is actually most of the population. And I know some of you will be aware of literature about youth around the world, in Africa and elsewhere, waiting for adulthood, waiting to be able to take responsibility. And I'm thinking in some African countries, that's pretty much the whole population. So, what does that mean? It's quite an interesting thought, isn't it? Youth in Africa is a very different thing to what youth is in Japan, where there are hardly any. Yeah, and that is part of the global future that I hope we can think about today. Demographically, it's hugely significant. Anyway, I have another representative of youth who I'm going to hand over to now, who's going to be giving our keynote address. Chido Mpemba is, younger than me, as you'll notice, and is the African Union's chairperson youth envoy. There's a blurb about her here in the program, which I hope you'll all read, but I think I'm going to call you up straight away and let's move on with the day. So, welcome, and you got very colour. As you got up there, I thought you were very colour coordinated with the yes. Welcome. I'll go and sit down. Get out of the way.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. And I'll just say hello, everyone. Such an honor to be here and to be able to interact with you today and be able to address you in this keynote. But first of all, before I get into that and just speak briefly on the topics that we'll be addressing today, I want to speak a little bit about the African Union and a little bit about Agenda 2063. Because we tend to assume that everyone really knows what Agenda 2063 is about, yet a majority of people are actually not aware what it's about. And I actually realized that most of the time when I travel and I interact with young people, they ask me these questions. Like, what is Agenda 2063? What does Agenda 2063 mean for young people? What is Agenda 2063 for the generation of now and of the future? And what is the work of the African Union? So I'll just touch briefly on that. I'll start with Agenda 2063. So now Agenda 2063 is anchored on the decisions that has come from the African Union member states, the 55 countries, in terms of the aspirations that they want to meet, that they would like to meet according to the Africa that we want. But the drivers of Agenda 2063 is every individual and every citizen of Africa. I'll also speak on Aspiration 6 specifically because I run with Agenda 2063 Aspiration 6. And Agenda 2063 Aspiration 6, it speaks about an Africa whose development shall rely on the potential of its people, especially its women and its youth. And when I look into this room, that is the potential that we're talking about in Agenda 2063 Aspiration 6. And this is a responsibility for every citizen, it's a responsibility for our governments, it's a responsibility for the private sector to ensure that we really look at the Africa that we want. And specifically looking and knowing that the largest demographic that we have in Africa are the youth, then it means that we should be the drivers of that Africa that we want and the Africa that we would like to realize. So Agenda 2063, I mean, just like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2063s are the goals for Africa, goals coming from Africa, designed by Africans, and goals that are being implemented by various institutions to ensure that really we look at the challenges that are faced with, not only in the context of Africa, but even in the global context, because we actually, also play that role, and I believe that young Africans has a role to play when it comes to the challenges that we're faced with globally, as well as in a global context. So I just thought to speak briefly about that, and also to ensure that we take ownership of that Africa that we want, and we take ownership of Agenda 2063, because Agenda 2063 is actually also you and I that are in this room. So now just to briefly speak ahead of the summit, in the next few days, I'd just like to zone in. Like I was really reflecting and I was just thinking to myself, when we talk about the now in the future generation, what does that now represent? And I realized that now can actually mean different to a lot of people. My now might be different to your now. That now is also different to a young girl who's sitting in a community, in a marginalized community, who does not have access to technology and does not even know half the stuff that's being done in this room. So that now is really different for a lot of people. But what I've seen is when we even look at that now in a different context, the challenges are similar and they're the same. And there's so many challenges that we need to address globally, but there are also challenges that we need to address in the context of Africa. And I just want to give you a picture of that now, just to speak briefly and focusing on 3 elements, because I know these elements is what we're going to get into during the summit for the 2 days. And these 3 elements are on climate change, unemployment, and peace and security. Just briefly looking at what is the now of Africa, realistically, when we look at these 3. So now just to speak about the climate change. We often face with loss and damage. We often face with loss and damage in Africa, and this is an impact on the level of development and opportunities available for us as young people. And we've also recently witnessed yet another horrific natural disaster on the continent, which has been caused by Cyclone Freddy, and the death toll which has risen as well, which has surpassed 600 in Malawi. And ultimately that has also caused, issues to do with public health and cholera outbreak that has arisen as well in Malawi. And as we all know, as the climate crisis persists, extreme weather events will become more common in sub-Saharan Africa. And the climate discussions in Africa need to focus on climate justice. And it also needs to focus on some of the small nations, like the example I've given for Malawi, that are now experiencing the repercussions of global warming, despite having benefited very little from global industrialization. So even when you look at meetings like COP28, just recently last week, I was at the UAE for the launch of the road to COP28 and the discussions that are happening there. But when you look at the context for Africa, we're really faced with the issue to do with loss and damage. And we need more investments that will go towards loss and damage. Poor rural communities, have been ravaged by the disasters, these natural disasters that we're talking about. And also as a result, besides the, public health conditions, we also look at the issues to do with insecurity, food insecurity, in addition to the health crisis, lack of productivity, and ultimately poverty, negating any progress that is supposed to be made by Agenda 2063 as well as the UN SDGs. And there also needs to be adequate compensation and climate adaptation in African communities. Because of this threat of climate change, in terms of safeguarding lives and the livelihoods, especially for young people, for women, and for children, because we are the now, but we also make up the future generation. There's so much that we can go on and on about, but we really know that there's a crisis that we have globally, and that crisis is climate change. But the way that has affected Africa has really been when it comes to loss and damage, ultimately also having an effect on public health and some of the issues that I've spoken about. We need to speak more on it, but in as much as we speak more on it, we need to also act more on that. And I often say less speech is a more concrete action. And I hope that we can all reflect, even when we get out in the breakout sessions, that it goes beyond speaking, but what are we going to do with the recommendations that are going to come from this summit? Are we going to raise our voice collectively on the global stage to make sure that these issues are really addressed and that we have a say to the solutions for our Africa? Is something I want to leave with you today. Number two, if I can just zone in briefly on youth unemployment. Before we look at the opportunities that are available to us, we need to recognize the current workforce. And the current workforce, if we really speak honestly, is an aging workforce, especially when you look at the public sector, when you looked at government, when you looked at political participation. Most of the people that we have in office are the older generation, and we have few young people that are running for office, few young people that are given those opportunities to run for office, few young people that are given access to opportunities to be able to grow and build their capacity to run for office. Now, due to the lack of opportunities, besides the public sector, I mean, of course, we look at, private sector too, and due to the lack of opportunities available on the continent for further development, people remain the same or similar at similar level roles until retirement, which also then creates a bottleneck and no access for youth to thrive and be able to upskill. Africa's nearly 420 million young people are unemployed and very, very discouraged. This is also due to the lack of job opportunities. This is also due in terms of skill mismatch, where we have a lot of graduates, but they're not able to actually match the skills that are needed on the market and be able to match this globally. Again, due to digital innovation and technology and the advancement of the world and the fourth industrial revolution. According to the Africa Development Bank, about 10 to 12 million young Africans enter the labor market each year, where only 3 million formal jobs are available. What are we going to do about that? It means even in this room, we're going to have graduates. Some might go back home, some might remain, but again, what are the opportunities that are available for employment? Do we have young people also thinking around creating that employment? Do we have young people thinking around, starting their own businesses, entrepreneurship? Do we have young people that are actually being empowered to be able to do so? Because right now we have a crisis, and that crisis is on unemployment. And until we address that crisis, it means we're going to be in the same pattern in Africa when it comes to economic development, which is stagnant at the moment. We also have young people from Africa that are risking their lives to seek opportunities outside of the continent to better themselves. And we have seen the dangerous, consequences that have come from this through the illegal crossing on the Mediterranean, trying to cross their way and come to Europe. And again, this is a reality that we're faced with in Africa. Due to the issues to do with climate change, due to the issues to do with lack of employment opportunities, young people are crossing over and sometimes illegally. And again, this also then presents a challenge, for our young people across the continent, as well as the dangers that come with it. Now, I'll also speak briefly on the AFCFTA, because the theme for the African Union for this year is accelerating the implementation of AFCFTA. And I know last year, the keynote address for the London School of Economics Africa Summit was actually our AFCFTA Secretary General, which is one of the agencies of the African Union, and that I have a privilege to also work with to ensure that we really convene youth and mainstream the work of youth. The AFCFTA agreement once fully implemented, will unleash the continental GDP towards $4 trillion. This being the year of the AFCFTA, it is my duty to also ensure that we as young people from all over the continent and beyond understand and access this important tool for economic development. Currently, what's being negotiated is the Protocol on Women and Youth until June, and this process started last year. And through these consultations, we're really working with young people to ensure that when the country negotiations are ongoing, there's also specifically negotiations to do with young people and women. And again, it needs us to be able to own this. It needs us to be able to co-design this. It needs us to ensure that we're fully involved in this. AFCFTA is going to have its first summit that's upcoming in April, from the 15th and 17th of April in Cape Town. But this is also going to be hybrid. But we need to ensure that we take part in these conversations, because again, it's going to affect us when they're doing these negotiations, when they're finalizing on these negotiations. We are the now and we are the youth. But when you speak about the future generation, what we allow to happen now in those protocols, what we agree on in these consultations is also ultimately going to affect the future generation. So it's really important that we get involved, and we get involved now. At the same time, failure to implement AFCFTA and unlock economic progress and prosperity on the continent will continue to stifle the potential of the future generation of Africa. And this will also manifest in not just poverty, but also continued conflict and lack of peace. Again, a challenge that we're faced with in Africa. So as such, it is important that we achieve our economic goals, to modernize our continent, to develop people, and to provide decent work opportunities for all, especially for our young people. Now, as I'm about to conclude on this, I'd like to just briefly touch on peace and security. Africa has consistently been plagued with war and conflict. Just in recent weeks, we've seen a number of protests on all corners of the continent. And it is a priority of mine to promote peace and security for young people across the continent. But I believe it needs us to join hands to be able to promote that. But also, we need to be honest. Realistically speaking, what is causing this instability in Africa? What is causing this conflict in Africa? We need to address it from the root cause. We need to ensure that there's intergenerational co-leadership. We need to make sure that we're involved in the processes that will lead to peace and security across the continent, not only for us, but also for the future generation. Because of time, of course, I cannot delve into what has been the main causes and the root cause for these challenges and the conflict that we see that have arisen in Africa. So now, while if we're able to maintain the peace and security in our African communities, this can advance greatly and enable many to achieve their potential and the attainment of the global development, as well as development on the continent. Now, in conclusion, I've learned that it is important to be proactive as opposed to being reactive when it comes to a lot of crises that we see today, and not even just, forgetting the pandemic, recently as over the COVID-19 pandemic. We never know what's around the corner, nor its impact. The impact it's going to have on us as individuals, the impact it's going to have on our families, the impact it's going to have on our communities, and ultimately this will also have an impact on the continent as a whole. So we should be compelled to do more for Africa, as it will impact the future generations too. It is not just about what we will only benefit in the now generation, but also future-proofing the next generation. And in the same vein, we are now living the reality of the decisions that were made by the past generations. We will not feel the effects of what we do now, but those that come after us will. So please make sure you really zone in on that. Right now, we're literally living in ultimately the reality of the decisions that were made by the past generations. What decisions are we going to make now as a now generation? Because those decisions is a reality that the future generation is going to live. So we need to ensure that we play a role, and that the future generation, when we have that future generation, they're empowered to continuously build and grow the Africa that we want and the Africa that we are going to create. the Africa that we are going to take a stand, and the Africa that we are all going to have a voice in to ensure that we fully develop it. Now let us come together and take the steps to change Africa, and also make sure that we bring our brothers and sisters along. Again, as I mentioned, not everyone has opportunity to be in this room. We still have a lot of marginalized young women that are living in rural communities that don't have these opportunities, but actually also have the potential to grow Africa and develop it. By focusing on various areas such as to do with climate change, peace and security, and youth unemployment, we can be the Africa that we want. The Africa that we want to see today, and the Africa that we want for tomorrow. So I'll leave you with these questions. What can we do to effect change which benefits us for the future and sets us up to lead globally? What access would you have wanted to have, which you found to be limiting? And what can we do together collectively to ensure that access becomes available, the access to opportunities, the access to resources, the access to lead change, the access in our communities, the access in our governments to be able to contribute when it comes to policy, and policy that will benefit the future generation. Again, I didn't touch on corruption, but it's something that we know is very pertinent right now in Africa. How are we going to stop corruption in Africa? Are we that generation that is going to ensure that when it comes to the future, we still have corruption? Are we going to be that generation that's going to ensure that, these changes come and they come from us? Let us be innovative and bring to life the Africa that we want. And I believe that the Africa that we want will come from us working together collaboratively as young people. Collaboration over competition, because often what happens is because we have such a small space when it comes to opportunities, we tend to work in competition versus to work in collaboration. But can you just imagine when we're saying we have the largest demographic in Africa being the youngest people? Over 870 million young people. Can you just imagine when we raise our voices collectively? When we come together, we speak with the same voice, beyond our nationalities, beyond various cultures, beyond various religious backgrounds, but having something in common, that we are the youth, we're the largest demographic, and ultimately we're actually faced with the same challenges, beyond political interests and various political parties. When we come together, we will raise our voice. And when we take up these spaces, we will ensure that Africa rises and we create the Africa that we want. I'd just like to say congratulations to the amazing team that has put this together. And I really wish you all very successful deliberations for the next 2 days. Not only that, but remember that less speeches and more concrete action. What are you going to contribute beyond what's going to come out of the solutions or the recommendations from this summit? What are you going to contribute back home to your community? What are you going to contribute back home to your country? And what are you going to contribute in Africa? You're welcome in my office so we can develop this Africa together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chido, for such an empowering speech. I think what stuck with me was working collaboratively and not working competitively, and being the drivers and the catalyst for the change that we want to see on our continent. I probably should have said